Hello and welcome back to Brain Bites. Today's topic is directly connected to your economic health and the everyday choices we make as a society. We're jumping right into this explainer to completely cut through all the political rhetoric. Whether you voted Leave or Remain a decade ago, our goal today is super simple. We're objectively examining the hard macroeconomic data on Brexit. Seriously, 10 years after the 2016 referendum, what do the actual numbers tell us? Let's dive right in.
To really wrap our heads around this complex shift, we've broken this explainer into 5 key areas. We'll look at the evolution of predictions, the latest economic data, the mechanics of economic growth, the difference between the single market and customs, and finally, the long-term trade impact.
All right, Section 1, the evolution of predictions. Let's look at how the consensus has shifted over time. The economic narrative has evolved so dramatically since the vote. Back in 2016, major institutions like Treasury were predicting a pretty severe 5 to 10% long-term hit to GDP. But then, between 2018 and 2022, the early post-Brexit reality actually seemed a bit milder, pointing to maybe a 2 to 5% drop. Now, though, as we look at comprehensive studies rolling in from 2024 to 2026, the consensus has totally boomeranged right back to that original 5 to 10% range. So you might be wondering, why the sudden shift back?
Well, it literally just comes down to data availability. Those early estimates simply didn't have the long-term data on the actual rules of the road, specifically the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, or TCA. Now that the TCA has been running for a few years, economists aren't just making educated guesses or forecasts anymore. They can finally map out the actual sustained economic impact.
Moving right along to Section 2, the latest economic data. Let's look at the sustained numbers. According to some really rigorous research by the Centre for European Reform, the UK economy was already 5.5% smaller by mid-2022 than it would have been if it had just stayed on its previous trajectory. That is a massive divergence in just a few short years, which essentially means less overall wealth generated for the country as a whole. And hey, quick pause here. If you're finding this explainer useful so far, take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and reach more people. Okay, let's keep going. Now that GDP drop connects directly to trade volume. The Office for Budget Responsibility, which is the UK government's own fiscal watchdog, estimates that the total volume of UK imports and exports will be a staggering 15% lower, specifically due to leaving the EU. This isn't just a minor blip on the radar. We're talking about a fundamental structural downshift in exactly how much the country buys and sells across its borders. And when you translate those percentages into actual currency, the scale is honestly breathtaking. A 2020 study by Fetzer and Wang reveals an estimated loss of £50 billion in economic activity across the UK in 2019 alone. To put that massive number into perspective, that represents over 2% of the entire UK GDP, just vanishing in a single year. Which brings us to this incredibly authoritative finding from Goldman Sachs in 2024. They clearly point out that the structural and cyclical costs of leaving the EU are responsible for the UK growing 5% less than its international peers over an 8-year period. On top of that, they note that the overall final hit to the UK economy could ultimately reach 8% of real GDP. Let's jump to Section 3, Mechanics of Economic Growth. How do trade and the economy actually interact here? Hearing all these huge numbers, 5%, 8%, £50 billion, it's super easy to get completely lost in the macro statistics, right? But what actually drives this decline on the ground? Historically, EU membership facilitated freedom of movement for capital and labor, and it provided tariff-free access to 500 million consumers. That frictionless environment acted like a high-powered engine for growth, allowing companies to scale rapidly. Once you remove that foundational block, the systems built on top of it inevitably start to break down. The Bank of England breaks down exactly how removing this frictionless trade strangles a domestic economy. And it's basically a domino effect. New barriers mean lower trade and lower foreign direct investment, meaning fewer foreign companies are building factories or opening offices in the UK. Less investment means overall productivity drops. That, in turn, leads to tighter financial conditions, weaker demand, and ultimately a much higher risk of unemployment for everyday workers. Trade friction really is a fundamental drag on domestic prosperity.
Section 4. Single market versus customs. We need to separate the effects of these two distinct entities.
To truly grasp how this friction operates, we've got to separate the impact of leaving the single market from the impact of leaving the customs union. Looking at data projected for 2026, we see a really stark contrast. Goods exports, the actual physical items moving across borders, suffered a massive 16% hit. Meanwhile, services exports, things like finance and digital goods, are only 7% lower. So physical goods took more than double the economic damage.
When we step back and look at the larger picture, a really vital distinction emerges. Out of an estimated 12% total decline in UK exports to the EU, the overwhelming majority of that damage, literally 10 out of that 12%, stems specifically from exiting the single market. Leaving the customs union, that only accounts for the remaining 2%.
So why is the single market exit so much more damaging? It comes down to single market trade friction. We aren't just talking about basic customs tariffs here. We're talking about the massive, compounding regulatory costs related to new certification procedures, safety checks, and strict compliance with EU standards. These complex regulatory hurdles create severe, everyday friction. They stop highly productive UK firms from seamlessly exporting, basically burying them in paperwork and delays that simply didn't exist a decade ago.
Finally, Section 5, the long-term trade impact. Let's look at the future projections.
So, how do these specific trade mechanics actually project into our future? Well, research clearly demonstrates that the economic friction of Brexit isn't just a one-time shock that we simply bounce back from. Instead, it's a gradual, compounding escalation. Current projections show the negative impact will reach roughly 5 to 6% of GDP by the year 2035. For the average citizen, that equates to a staggering £2,300 of lost potential wealth per person.
And here is exactly where the hard data clashes with some of the ongoing political debates. Because the primary driver of this export depression is the loss of single market regulatory alignment, economists note that merely rejoining the customs union isn't some magic silver bullet. It would actually only undo a very small fraction of the economic damage the UK is currently experiencing.
All of this meticulously gathered data leaves us with a stark, challenging reality to ponder. If tweaking customs rules isn't enough to reverse the trend, how does the UK fundamentally restructure its growth strategy, its investments, and its domestic productivity in a strictly post-single market world? It's a massive puzzle to solve, and the data strongly suggests the clock is ticking. If you enjoyed this explainer, hit the like button, share it with others, and subscribe to Brain Bites for more valuable insights. Thanks so much for joining me. Keep questioning the data, and I'll see you next time.